A lot to get through there, and joining us now is the host of the WGN Political Report, Paul Lisnek.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Paul. So much going on.
Oh, my God.
It's just been 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The latest that's just breaking just not long ago, he's going to clear out the DOJ, the folks who went against him on January 6th.
Yes, it
Getting
looks
rid
like,
of them.
right, it's sort of a Friday night purge
Yeah.
when supposedly folks aren't watching it, but
Like
we have
the
24-hour news
Saturday Night Massacre.
of Nixon days. Yeah.
Right.
So what has happened here is they're actually going after basically anybody that even touched any of the Trump litigation or investigations and letting them know that they would be released. But there's a couple of interesting things about that. Number one, they're talking about releasing their names, and apparently the memo includes the names. Well, with, of course, a lot of the Trump supporters released from prison and many of them saying we need retribution, we need to go after the people who did this, that's a serious concern for these FBI folks who are being let out. But secondly, and I have to say this, so many of the people being fired now, these are not political appointees. These are frontline career lawyers, just like people that just have a job.
They're just losing their jobs
They're
now.
just losing their job, except they're going to be tagged with this, you were part of the Trump prosecution.
Even though it was assigned to them.
Exactly. They could have been assigned to anything, but this is what they were assigned to, and this is what they did. But one other little thing as we try and analyze all this kind of stuff, these folks do have a lawsuit because you cannot fire civilly employed employees without cause. You need cause to do it. There is no cause here. So they could sue. Several are already planning on suing. What does that mean? Well, there would be a trial in that case, and then all of this January 6th stuff and whatever they were investigating would actually come into the evidence and come out. So those things President Trump didn't want to have come out, he might find out comes out through these lawsuits down the line.
And related to that, Governor Pritzker says he's not going to allow anybody who was involved in January 6th to be hired here in Illinois.
And he can say that, but again, look at the law, but expect the lawsuits, because once again, when somebody says, but I've been pardoned, and that's who Pritzker's talking about, I've been pardoned, and that means that it's cleared off my record, that I shouldn't be barred from holding a position. So expect some lawsuits there. The courts are going to have a very busy several years coming up.
Illinois was one of the states that sued the Trump administration over this funding freeze.
Yeah.
The White House then rescinded that. Talk to me about all of the agencies and many others who depend on that funding. Do you feel like they can now breathe a sigh of relief, or is the threat still not over for
Oh, the
them?
threat's not over because...
No, he just pulled back the memo.
Yeah,
right?
some people, I know this is very confusing, and it is confusing, but so there's the executive order that freezes the funding to all these agencies, and nobody was quite sure who was getting hit with it. And then came the budget memo that authorized this. That was the budget memo that got pulled, but then word from the White House saying, no, wait, these freezes, this is still in effect. We just pulled the budget memo. So you could talk to members of Congress and say what is going on, and they would say, I don't get it, right? It is confusing. So we don't know yet what is going to hit, but I will say that every time a certain group, Medicare, whatever, said, wait a minute, is this us? The White House would say, we didn't mean that. Well, we didn't mean that. It's unclear what they're going after. We just know they're going to go after something. One of the things also coming out today as well is that some Treasury Department heads have walked off the job and have quit because Elon Musk basically asked them to give him access to the computers that pay all the checks, the budget. I mean, like the computers that distribute all the money. He didn't want to do it. He quit. The question I have is, why does Elon need access to that
And how can he get
system?
that legally?
Well, if the president authorizes it and the people who were blocking his way have stepped away, I guess that's how it happens. Hasn't happened yet.
Let's talk about the confirmation hearings. We had quite a few of them.
Yeah.
We had RFK, Kash Patel, we had Tulsi Gabbard. A lot of stuff going on in that. A lot of Democrats not happy. Even some Republicans weren't happy with some of the things that went on.
Republicans were concerned about Tulsi Gabbard, so and we saw some of them being pretty tough on her. Bobby Kennedy, one senator, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, and he's a physician.
Right.
He clearly, and he said he's concerned about Bobby Kennedy over the vaccine issues and others. So actually, if you have Mitch McConnell, who had polio when he was a child, and if you have Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, and if Bill Cassidy joins them, that is enough to kill the RFK nomination. We'll see. Because remember that Joni Ernst, when it came to Pete Hegseth, she too was all hot and bothered about everything. It wasn't going to do anything. And then apparently when she was put under tremendous pressure from the administration, reportedly said to her staff, how do I make this stop? And the answer was, well, you're going to have to support Hegseth. So will Bill Cassidy come under that kind of pressure? I'm not sure. We'll see what happens with Kash Patel. Really interesting there because there's so much on tape for him in interviews. interviews he's done. One of the things Senator Durbin asked him was, do you know who Stu Peters is? He goes, no, I don't know him. I've never heard of him. And he goes, you did his podcast eight times.
8 times.
Eight
I thought it was
times.
3. Okay.
And this
8.
is the podcast where he said so many of these things, whatever, but he has no memory, never heard about it. He was part of, and there's him on tape and recordings doing the January 6th choir. That's what people know about, right? That recorded the national. And at this hearing, I never heard of them. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who was part of it. So you have to wonder whether even Republicans are buying any of that. But here's the bottom line. I think we can safely say that pre-MAGA times, there isn't a Republican on any of these committees who would vote for any of these nominees. They just wouldn't. Not a traditional Republican. Those are not the days we're in anymore. And now the pressure on the White House, from the White House, is so severe that it's be tough for me to sit here and say any of them would be tossed, because the Republican senators seem to fold and go. And all they needed the Republican senators to do it.
Of those, who do you think would be most in jeopardy? Would it
Could be Tulsi Gabbard, because she also, one of the questions, this is where the Republicans hit her too, was about Edward Snowden, basically saying, is he a traitor to the country? And most Republicans and the Democrats believe he was a traitor to the country. She would not say that. The other thing none of them would say, by the way, when asked, would you, if you were given an order from the president that was illegal or unconstitutional, would you do it? Not one of them would answer that question. They all worked around it. Kash Patel was asked, who will you report to? And he said, sorry, who do you work for? That was the question. Who do you work for? He goes, well, I would report to the Attorney General, who works directly with the president. He would never tie himself directly to the president. When asked whether he would get rid of all these FBI officials, he said, no, I would never get rid of anybody. It's being done for him before he would ever get there.
Interesting. Let's talk about the tariffs. We talked a little bit about that already, but there are some real indications that this will worsen inflation. We already heard the Prime Minister of Canada seeming to hint that there will be retaliatory tariffs as well.
Well, remember, it's supposed to happen tomorrow. This is President Trump, so anything can happen. He can decide at the end not to do it. He can decide at the end that everybody has given in to his demands. We'll see tomorrow what happens. But with a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, Jenna showed some clips. We see that those countries are not happy about this. I just think people need to understand that when you put a tariff on Canada, Canada doesn't pay the tariff. We pay the tariff. Same with Mexico, same with China. We pay the tariff. It's paid at the border, and it's the importer who pays it, and the importer passes it on. So as economic experts will tell you, if those tariffs go into effect in very short order, prices are going up significantly. President Trump was asked about that. His comment was, well, the people will understand that this is what we have to do. I'm not so sure they will, because people are pretty concerned about the price of their groceries.
That's a hypothetical that we're not going to get into.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, President Trump himself said the magic word grocery. That's what got me elected. We're going to lower grocery prices.
Terrible, tragic crash yesterday at Reagan International Airport. And the president coming out, giving his condolences to the victims and their families. But then he kind of blamed the accident on DEI. Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois was not happy.
Blamed it on DEI and Biden and Obama and went back and forth. Part of that is the fact that President Trump does not like to take responsibility for anything bad that's going on. But there's kind of a rule for presidents. Whatever happens on your watch, you get the blame and you get the credit. So President Trump was taking credit when things were good under the Biden administration, saying, well, everybody knows I'm coming back, and so things are good. It just doesn't work that way. Biden gets the credit until he leaves office, and then Trump gets the credit, or blame, same for both, once he is in office. So, and these people that were involved in this, we don't know specifically, but I don't think any of them had, were just hired or hired $1 million. We don't know yet.
Talking about the air traffic controllers.
The air traffic controllers, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're going to find out about that, but I'm not so sure at a time of grieving when the president and the commander-in-chief should be helping a nation heal, that's the time to start pointing fingers at DEI and those kind of things.
But didn't the president, during his first administration, didn't he change things around? And now he's saying that he didn't like the way they were changed and blamed it on Obama and Biden.
What he said was, he said that Biden and Obama were concerned about policy. He was concerned about safety. Okay. I don't really know what to make of that statement. Everybody's obviously concerned about safety when it comes to that world.
Okay. How about the show this weekend?
Yeah, so this weekend we're going to explore some of these issues, as you might guess. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy is going to join me, and he is going to talk about what is going on in Washington. It's probably some of the things that we're talking about as well. And then Precious Brady Davis, right, commissioner on the Metropolitan Water District. She's going to join me. She's the first black trans woman serving in elected office here in Illinois. Illinois, where she's going to talk about the difficulties or challenges of doing that in this world. And
We
then
talked to her today about the flooding issues that are going
yes,
on.
and yes, yeah. Well, she was here, so
Yeah,
got to tap
yeah.
into that and use that. And then on Monday, this will be cool. Juan Williams of Fox News is going to join me. He's got a new book called New Prize for These Eyes about what he calls the second civil rights movement, and he'll join me at 11:45 on the Midday News. I'll talk to Juan.
Great.
Sounds good, Paul.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Paul.
Have a good
weekend.
weekend.
You too.